Indeed, he has often cited tariffs as one of his favorite policy tools, not reminding the American voter that it's the American consumer who pays for those. It's a fundamental point. It would also be a surprise to actually then impose tariffs on our two major trading partners who are our neighbors, who are part of, and he helped negotiate the update of the trading relationship with both with Canada and Mexico. So it'd be rather ironic for it to do so.
It's nearly been a month since the US election, since it was announced that Trump had won. We're already beginning to see early signs of what a Trump second presidency could look like. What is standing out to you at the moment about this?
There are several trends that we can begin to see at this stage. One of the trends will be to what extent will there be continuities with priorities from the first Trump administration. That will be the case for any president who is elected for his second term. So that will be one trend. What areas that in which he was interested will again be areas of focus for him and for his administration. Another track will be to what extent will he introduce new areas of concern, areas which were not priorities earlier, which become priorities now, partially because the world has changed. So we'll want to look out for that as from his perspective, what might be new. And then I think the third area will be what will be the reactions from the rest of the world, that the rest of the world also will have its views of what the incoming administration will be doing and how they will respond. And the rest of the world also, just like American citizens, will draw conclusions from the first term. And all of those will intersect as we see, as we look ahead to his actual inauguration and the beginning of his second term.
And a big concern, especially from the European community, is about NATO and potentially the US's membership with NATO, which Trump has, threatened in the past when he was president last time. How do we see that playing out this time?
There are important transatlantic and global issues that will be immediate questions. One area, as you mentioned, is the United States membership in NATO. However, I would suggest that more likely would be the incoming administration putting greater pressure on NATO members to bear more of the defense costs. NATO remains the premier alliance of the United States. The network of global alliances is crucial to American foreign policy. Most foreign policy leaders in both parties still believe that, even in the Republican Party as well. And so I think it's more likely that you will see greater pressure for NATO to take on additional responsibilities. The acute situation, of course, will be the question of support for Ukraine. But the other thing to keep in mind is that NATO also provides even more support for the United States than it did 4 years ago. Something to keep in mind is that the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland actually has meant that NATO and NATO members are supplying more security in the high north or in the Arctic region. And people forget the United States is also an Arctic state. And while the United States and Canada traditionally were the two NATO members had to worry about that, the actual expansion of NATO with two members who are actually bring significant assets is interesting and creates an interesting dynamic with those who recognize that the United States is having to defend the Arctic and is actually benefit for that. So it's interesting to see what's changed as well. But I would anticipate we would see more pressure from this administration on NATO and NATO members.
And we saw with his nomination of Marco Rubio for US Secretary of State, Rubio in the past, he was one of the 15 Republican senators to vote against a big military aid package to help Ukraine resist Russia and support other US partners. How do you think that this potential nomination of Rubio could impact, especially the war in Ukraine?
I think that will continue to be serious concerns about the long-term United States support for Ukraine. Indeed, that of course there is support that's in the pipeline that would continue, but I would not expect significant additions to that. And so that there'll be greater pressure on European allies and partners and others who are supporting Ukraine. That said, that the long-term stability of Ukraine will remain important for the long-term stability of Europe, which even the incoming administration recognizes as a fundamental U.S. interest. The United States needs peace in Europe. And the question is where that line is, but I think that the recognition of the severity of the issue will be important.
You've previously written about how the US's withdrawal from international or global organizations, it can give space for China to further spread its influence, especially within these institutions. Could you elaborate on that and what you mean by that?
An important part of the United States foreign policy since the end of the Second World War was the creation of institutions to manage stability internationally. And so those include, of course, the United Nations system, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and also the system of alliances we've discussed. And that, and of course, the priority has changed over the years, but the idea that you need to have structures that will actually support a world order that is beneficial to the United States has been fundamental. That said, there's been warmer and cooler periods dealing with international organizations. And the challenge, of course, for the United States is that although it has, of course, a veto in the Security Council, then the General Assembly, it's one vote among many. And so there's always been a certain skepticism and frustration with having to work in the General Assembly. I'll admit from both parties, from both major parties, because it's one of the places where the great powers have to listen to everybody. On the other hand, that's the point, that to have a place where everybody can come and speak, it's much better to have people arguing in a global body than fighting on the fields. That said, indeed that this administration is fairly skeptical. And one of the differences compared to previous administrations is that if we look at international organizations, we have the political organizations, what we usually think of, such as the General Assembly and Security Council, and we have the functional organizations. The functional organizations, I mean, whether it's the International Telecommunications Union that makes it possible to have all this wonderful technology, or if it's the International Civil Aviation Organization that handles aviation so that it's safe every time we fly internationally. Those are the functional organizations. One of the surprises, I think, of the first Trump administration was his willingness to bring forth the idea of pulling out of the World Health Organization during the pandemic. Because the World Health Organization is also one of the major functional organizations. It works on global public health, which is beneficial to all of us. I think the politicization of that was an extreme mistake because we need to have a place to cooperate on global health issues. But that will be one to look out for, and that is that will the next Trump administration still support the World Health Organization and other international health cooperation? That makes sense. That we need that to function, and so that's going to be extremely important to look out for.
And that brings me on to the UN. What did you make of Trump's nomination for ambassador to the United Nations?
It was definitely a surprise. Definitely a surprise. This member of Congress was not particularly associated with international issues and is more associated with the effort to undermine the presidencies of three of our leading universities, which was, I think, deeply troubling because we think that knowledge-based organizations are part of a liberal democracy. So that was certainly a challenge, but everybody can learn. Everybody can learn. If, of course, it has to be confirmed first, but some people, once they actually get into this, learn more about the United Nations, recognize that there are a wide range of activities that actually are important, as I say, to the daily functioning of the international system. And the United States needs those to work. And so we'll see. As I say, everyone can learn.
And then looking closer to home, we heard Trump recently announce that he will impose around a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada on day one of his administration, because he says that they need to stop the flow of illegal migrants and drugs into the US. What do you make of this? It's not the first time that Trump has tried to impose tariffs to get what he wants, isn't it?
Indeed, he has often cited tariffs as one of his favorite policy tools, not reminding the American voter that it's the American consumer who pays for those. It's a fundamental point. It would also be a surprise to actually then impose tariffs on our two major trading partners who are our neighbors, who were part of, and he helped negotiate the update of the trading relationship with both with Canada and Mexico. So it'd be rather ironic for it to do so. I would have thought he might hear from some of his supporters in the business community who might be deeply concerned by taking that sort of action that soon. Now, whether he takes actions towards China is a different question, but such dramatic trade actions penalizing our close neighbors and our treaty ally in Canada would be quite surprising. I think many in the business community who supported him might at least urge him to reconsider before January 20th.
Taking a look at his nominations for his cabinet, what impact do you think this will have, or what reflection do you think this will have on the international community, but also how they perceive the US? We have a few interesting figures within the mix. Matt Gaetz has had to step down as Attorney General.
Well, first, I should say that every president does bring in a mix of people into his and maybe someday hers cabinet. That indeed that you want to draw on a range of expertise. So cabinet members are not always people who have served at the federal level in government. They may come from other walks of life, depending on the particular cabinet position. What you do want to be sure is that irrespective of where they've had their career, that they are deeply qualified to run their organizations. And that includes both deep substance matter expertise or familiarity. And then the second part is actually being able to run very large agencies. Something like the Defense Department is an enormous organization. And so that is, it's important to be able to manage an organization of that size. That said, if we look at the foreign affairs issues, one of the more qualified people who was less surprising of those who were nominated is the nomination of Senator Rubio as Secretary of State. He is a United States Senator. They, of course, are responsible for multiple activities, including confirming diplomats as well as judges. And he did serve on the Foreign Relations Committee, so it's a more normal one. I think there'll be the greater concerns will be particularly on the defense side and the intelligence side, and those I think they're raised quite a lot of concern. We'll see what happens. I think the important thing out of here is to actually have the confirmation process. That I think the idea of emergency appointments, recess appointments, is not a wise one. That actually you do no favors to the nominee to shorten the process. One of the things the process does is allow the Senate to do its job of advice and consent, but it also allows the incoming official time to learn something. They consume large amounts of briefing materials for this, but they also have a chance so that when they walk through the door, they have some idea of what they're doing. It's beneficial for everybody in the process. So I think it's extremely important that we do actually have the formal confirmation process as is the norm, and then we'll see who's actually confirmed and whether they'll be able to work together.